Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. True's talks, as you know, were postponed the last year or so. I can't remember how many talks have been postponed. And we decided to move some into June, 4 talks in these special conditions. In September, another series of talks begins, and we hope there'll be some sort of normality. We can go back to what we had before, but we don't know, do we? We're hoping so. So thanks for coming along. And there are 4 talks, and I always do the first one, I always kick off. And I sometimes forget to say, if there's a fire or a crisis, we have to go that way and down the stairs into the yard. Please don't go back that way if we have to leave quickly, because, well, you know, the narrow corridors and so on. And for goodness sake, don't get into this lift on the left here, because I don't think that would be a good idea. Avoid lifts. But we'll just simply go that way and down the stairs if there is a crisis. And then at 5 to 12, Rebecca will come along, and I think she wants you to go out that way. I mean, she's got some system. All these things, she's got systems. And we're going to have a donation box as well. So if you've got a few coins, because I think in normal times, now we're talking about normal times, before March 2020, we did 16 talks a year, and the donations brought in £1,000 a year. You know, which for True's is a lot of money. You know, so but it's not just for that. I mean, True's does this because of its education mission. You know, it's about education, community. I mean, that's the driving force. But to have donations is also very helpful, because we all have to live, don't we? We all need money to live and pay the rent. And I saw a programme on, listened to a programme yesterday morning on the radio, I think it was. I listened to the telephone-ins. All these 400,000 people are behind with the rent by thousands of pounds. What's going to happen to them? I just don't know. I thought how lucky I am to live in a house in Queen Street, not under threat, you know, and we're always grumbling about things and plagues and so on, but many of us, not all of us, but many of us are very lucky to be as we are, to remember that. I try and remember it, although I do occasionally complain. So this is about the plague. Obviously, I thought it was appropriate, and because years ago, and this is years ago, it's the 1980s in fact, I used to sit in the town hall, Undercroft, where the old record office was, and I read through all the council minutes from 1850 backwards to 1350. But I wouldn't claim to have read every page. I skimmed them a lot. But one of the things, of course, by the time I got to the 17th century, going backwards, and the writing started to go funny, because one of the things which popped up all the time was the plague. Because in all European countries in the 16th and 17th centuries, the plague was a major factor. The European population didn't really expand until the 18th century. From the 18th century, 19th century, into the 20th century, even believe it or not, in the 18th century, beginning of the 18th century, even the Chinese population wasn't very big, believe it or not. This huge expansion of the global population in the 18th century was linked to climate, agriculture, capitalist production and so on. But before that, the disappearance of the plague, of the old type of plague, which this is about, and you know about the Black Death in the Middle Ages, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, the plague, the fertility cycle, population historians, which I was always been interested at university, I did my BA dissertation on medieval population in Bedfordshire, and mainly Bedfordshire because I had better sources, surviving documents than Norfolk. And this was at Birmingham University. And Professor Rodney Hilton, a great man in medieval history, I think he's dead now, I really got into population studies and reading all the books I could. And one of the things which is interesting is the fertility cycle, that everything depends on that for the growth of population. And the fertility cycle means women aged between 15 and 40. Women between 15 and 40 can have children. You know, I know it's a generalisation, but in effect, 15 to 40 is called the fertility cycle. And if lots of women and people of that age die because of the plague or whatever it is, they're not going to have children to grow up and increase the population. The population of Europe didn't increase much. The population of England in 1500 was about 5 million. And in 1700, 200 years later, it was about 6 million. In 200 years, it hardly increased. From Domesday Book in 1086, 1 million people. England and Wales in 1800 was 9 million, so it took 800 years. I think there's 800 years to go from 1 million to 8. Big deal. And yet from 1800 to 1900, the population of England and Wales went up from 9 million to 36 million in 1 century. And you think of the number of houses in this country. Many of us live and work in Victorian houses. Well, we're always hearing complaints. The schools, especially in the northern towns, schools and hospitals and they're all 19th century. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of housing in this country is 19th century. It was such a huge boom. And of course, lots of books have been written about housing in the 19th century. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it was the plague which kept population back. That's why it was like a huge brake on the growth of population, because it was so frequent it cut people down. But what I want to, before I show you a few slides, just to make 5 or 6 points about Lynn, which are applicable to all English towns, that don't think Tudor and Stuart Lynn was a port and a market town. It was about 5,000 to 6,000 people during this period, maybe going up to about 7,000 by 1700. It rapidly went up in the late 17th century after the last plague outbreak in 1665. But the population was seafaring, maritime. The weekly markets were important. So it was a medium to large size English town. I mean, today you would say King's Lynn, many people would say King's Lynn is a small town. The census will come out soon. I wonder what we will say for King's Lynn. I would say King's Lynn has probably now reached 50,000. I mean, that includes the Wootons, of course. But King's Lynn, in 2007, the population of Lynn was 46,000, including the Wootons. So Lynn would be regarded by many people today as a small town, but it's not. It's becoming medium-sized. The biggest town after London is Birmingham by far. Birmingham population is still 1.2 million. Birmingham is a huge city. It's the biggest local authority in our country. And the West Midlands, of course, together, is about 4 million, and the Manchester conurbations. So Norwich is about 100. Norwich City, the actual Norwich City Council, control an area, only 125,000 people. Because the suburbs of Norwich have always not wanted to become part of Norwich, because it's too, in case they become Labour Party members, they've resisted that. Like people in East Riding of Yorkshire have resisted Greater Hull because they don't want to become part of Hull, which is very Labour. There's a lot of politics in all this, but the Hull has absorbed. Hull is much bigger than Norwich. Hull is 300,000 people. It's quite a big town. Norwich, with its suburbs, is 200,000 people. So Lynn today is not regarded as it's not a big town, but it was a big town in those centuries, the 16th and 17th century. And it was a major place and seaport for Europe. And remember, at that time, although the Atlantic was being opened up, our trade with Europe was far more important than trade with America in that period. It was in the 18th century when global world trade became more important to our country, and so Liverpool and Bristol and Plymouth with the Navy faced across the Atlantic became bigger than Boston, Lynn and Hull and the East Coast ports. But up until the 18th century, the East Coast ports were the biggest and the richest, trading with the Baltic, Norway, South France. Lynn, even in the 18th century, Lynn was the 4th biggest importer in this country of wine. There's all the wine cellars in Lynn. All the wine went upriver to Cambridge and Bedfordshire and Suffolk. No, Lynn was still a major port into the 18th century. And so that's the first thing, the sort of place Lynn was. The second thing to say is, don't think the ruling class in Lynn were all twits and the town was full of rubbish, and I won't use the word, 4-letter words, but that there was no cleanliness. There was, in the 16th and 17th century, there was a huge drive in European cities for cleanliness. Because if your city wasn't clean and spick and span and had the latest building design, you wouldn't attract merchants. The Dutch set a good example, and we copied the Dutch. The Dutch, as you know, made a big play in this period in, although they were breaking into the East Indies, but also in dairy farming, in claiming the polders and so on, the polders being made. For the Dutch economy, cleanliness was absolutely vital if they were going to make a success of their dairy and cheese industries. absolutely vital. There was no way, even at that period, that the Dutch were going to make a successful export trade of cheeses and dairy products if everyone thought Holland was dirty. Holland had to be clean. And so that was a very important point. And the Lynn ruling class were only a group of merchants. There's no democracy, of course. The town is ruled by 18 common councillors and 12 aldermen. And the aldermen are the chief, and from the aldermen, they pick each other. You know, there's no elections, except amongst this elite. And the mayor comes from the aldermen every year. Sometimes they do more than one term. But they are conscious of all these health factors. This is very, very important. About the Custom House was built to attract people to Lynn. The Duke's Head was built for foreign merchants resorting to Lynn. Lynn was a trading place, a crossroads. It had to be attractive. And a new market cross was built. The market cross sadly pulled down in 1831, but the market cross, an American friend of mine who writes about Georgian buildings in the United States, you know, that East Coast, Charleston, that area, he comes to Lynn with students, not this last year sadly. I'm hoping he'll come in this year. I don't know if he will though. He brings students from the University of Maryland, which is in Washington. And he was amazed by these buildings and pictures of the Market Cross. He's written an article about Lynn for an American magazine and says to how the Market Cross showed that Lynn's wealth and financial clout, the American word, financial clout, the Market Cross, how attractive. I mean, Lynn was in the mainstream of fashionable urban design in the 17th century, the English mainstream. If you don't believe me, ask my illustrious neighbour, Dr. Simon Thurley, you know, who specialises in this field. And so they were people conscious, they kept the town clean, they strived. It wasn't easy. Many parts of the town wouldn't have been clean, you know, because animals were kept in. Abattoirs were in the town. You know, chickens wandered about, pigs wandered about. But Lynn did have quite a few fields to the east within the defences where they could keep stuff. So these people responded to the plague in a very similar way to what's happened in our country. And one of the reasons I decided this talk was a good idea is because the responses in the 16th and 17th centuries was very, very similar to what we've experienced in the last year. Lockdowns, quarantines, isolations, stay-at-home orders, plague wardens to enforce things. You'd be amazed how similar the reaction was to what's happened in the last year. Quite extraordinarily the same, almost the same. And one thing they did do, which we haven't done, which would appall lots of people, I'm sure, that they thought dogs and cats carried the plague, so they shot them all. In Reykjavik, I remember it's about 30 years ago now, I remember there was some disease outbreak in Reykjavik in Iceland. And this is in recent times, and they blamed, the transmission of the disease was blamed on too many dogs. And they just shot them all in Reykjavik. But that's what happened. And so they are doing this, and although church services, people were still allowed to go to church. One of the interesting things for me, living near St Margaret's Church, is how the churches in our country closed up. But even in the 17th century in Lynn, the churches were never closed. People went to church because one reason was, of course, that God was punishing the population. So one dimension of this was that the Almighty was punishing a population, and when the plague disappeared, it was God's will. On the other side of the coin, the ruling group at the town hall did practical things to get rid of the plague. You know, it wasn't they didn't wait to hang around and say, well, God will get rid of this next month. They worked hard to control the outbreak. One of the problems with the Lynn, you'll see, is that it was such easy access, the plague. The coastal trade from Newcastle and Sunderland and all the plague, you know, all the colliers coming into Lynn and carrying the plague, people getting off ships, boats from Peterborough and Cambridge. Lynn, that side, coastwise and riverwise, was very vulnerable to the plague, like all ports. All ports, you'll see in most countries, the plague seems to start in ports. You know, like Alexandria in Egypt, often plague came from there to Europe. And Hamburg in Germany, often was the source of plagues, and because of the crossroads, it's a port town, as it still is, and so very vulnerable. On the other side of the coin, the town defences that side, the gates were shut to keep people out during the plague, to stop people coming into the market. But some were let through, but what did stop in these, when the plague struck, 1558, 1625, 1630, 1636, 1645, 1665. You know, you can easily tick the dates if you like. The mart was stopped, because when the mart was on, Lynn had a great fair every February in that period, had two before the 1540s. The town's population probably doubled. And the mart used to be in Norfolk Street with shops and stalls, and they thought, well, let's put it into a bigger space. So in 1584, when there was a plague outbreak, they moved the next year, they moved the mart into the Tuesday marketplace in the Common Stay, because it was a bigger open space. So even then, there was a sense of overcrowding and so on, and transmission of disease. But the London messages went to London, Norwich, Cambridge, with news from the mayor. The mart is closed. The mart is no longer possible. So the mart wasn't held during the plague years, but the markets were, because the markets had to be held to keep people fed. How were people going to be fed? Not everyone was sick. Someone had to be fed, and a great bonus for King's Lynn was the fishing fleet. And the fishing, the Wash is teeming with fish then, more than it is now, unfortunately. The fish was coming into Lynn every day by the fisher folk, except Sundays. So Lynn, the fish market, into the two marketplaces, there were markets, the two weekly markets, and a lot of that was fish from here. So that played a vital role. And there must have been enough corn, because during these epidemics, especially 1665, in 1665, it was the worst one really, in the city of London, 10,000 people died within the first few weeks, 10,000 people. And Daniel Defoe writes about it, Daniel Defoe, the great traveller. And he talks about how the ships, the corn ships, saved the Londoners from Lynn, from Boston, from Hull. So Lynn was sending corn to London during these epidemics to keep London fed, as it had done when the plague wasn't on. And the city of Cambridge once complained to the Privy Council in London, could they not send corn through Lynn to London, because the poor Cambridge scholars were starving. He said their bellies are being pinched. And basically the government in London, the Privy Council, the Queen's Privy Council, says, take a running jump, mate. There's no way we're going to let you keep all that. You've got to send it round to London. So all through these centuries, London is being fed as it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, far bigger than anywhere else, is being fed. And we have no record in Lynn or Boston of food riots, as we do earlier, like, for example, in the 15th century, on some occasions, and in the 14th century, when people see corn and food being exported and they're starving virtually, there are riots, food riots. I mean, I can give you references, but this is medieval mainly. And a book came out a couple of years ago, which I found very interesting, about these sparks. But we have no record of any food riots. In other words, people in 1625, when the plague broke out, there's no evidence of people by the waterside rioting, saying, we need that food. So presumably there was enough food coming in, allowed to come in, but also in Holland and England, in these centuries, the town councils bought food at the cheapest price. For example, the Lynn Council bought rye from Amsterdam. Ships from Amsterdam came in, and it was stored in what they called them rye, R-Y-E, rye barns. So corporations in city councils in Holland and Lynn stored food for a rainy day. And in both marketplaces, there were, in the Common Stay, there were sheds, or big sheds, or warehouses for food, waiting for a crisis. They could either give it out to the poor freely, as they sometimes did during the plague. They just fed people. In 1605, there was a plague outbreak just around the corner here in the North End, but nowhere else in King's Lynn. It's very odd. And the whole area was sealed off, and food was brought to the people. So where did that come from? It came from the corporation stock. So there were food resources in the Dutch, like Leiden, Amsterdam. They had these barns, and I think we in Lynn, we had such close connections. There were always people going between Lynn and the Netherlands. merchant. Lynn, in the 17th century, many Netherland merchants lived in King's Lynn. You know, we exported rapeseed to Holland. There was lots of interconnection. And you can see by the style of the custom house and the architecture. So we learned a lot from Holland, I think. And certainly the town council had sufficient resources to cope in terms of food. Otherwise, there had been a total breakdown and there would have been riots. So I think that's important to remember. There was no hospital as such, except the St James's Workhouse, which I'll show you a picture of. St James's Workhouse was, there's a bit left, it's opposite next door to the nursery school. You know the police station? You know the police station? Who doesn't know the police station? Opposite the park, there's the police station, and in that nursery playground is part of the old workhouse, which was St James's Chapel, but it was more or less, well, it was closed in the 1560s and became the chancel was pulled down and part of the nave, but they kept the transepts there, and there was a tower on top. So the chapel was turned into a workhouse, not because of the plague, but in the 1570s, when the guilds stopped, when the medieval ways of supporting the poor and needy, when the guild system and other charity systems stopped, the state had to take over in some way, and it was usually what I call King's Lynn, Norwich, Boston, the local state. Because remember, the London state, although they're powerful in London, they have no big bureaucracy, there are no civil servants sent to Lynn from London. These cities, we're like a city-state. The local state is in control. You know, the national state in London, yes, they come to Lynn and send messages. They come on horse bringing messages from the new council. Oh, there's a new tax coming out. One of the things in the 1630s is the king was taxing everyone for new ships. And the mayor of Lynn would write back to London saying, you know, we're really, you know, we haven't got any money. We're in distress this time. We've got no money to pay new taxes. We can hardly survive. So there's a lot of that going on, that kind of politics. And one of the worst outbreaks was 1597-98, when about 10% of the town's population died. And where they're going to bury all these people, because the churchyards are limited, they were used, of course, and they buried lots of people in what had been the burial grounds of the St James's Chapel, which is opposite the police station. And that was reopened in the 19th century, but there are lots of people underneath that area of Lynn. There are lots of things to be found, lots of citizens to be found, I think. And also the grave friars, because all the friaries had cemeteries, which were closed in the late 1530s, 1538, when Henry VIII closed the friaries down. Because many Lynn merchants and Hanseatic merchants, we know, they left information. They wanted to be buried in the friary. They didn't want to be buried at St Margaret's, because the bishops of Norwich weren't very popular. But St Nicholas here in the 14th century and St James's, they weren't allowed baptisms or marriages anyway. They were chapels of ease, but they were allowed burial grounds. And so 200, we know at least 200 people were buried at St James's Workhouse, or in the grounds of what was St James's Workhouse, which you can hardly see now. And it's now got that Methodist chapel, and behind the Methodist chapel is that new building, isn't it? The Vancouver building. It's called the Vancouver building, you know, with the tax offices and so on. But all that area was where a lot of activity was focused. So what I'm going to show you is some slides to illustrate these points, and to say that the death rate, we don't know, it's very difficult to know the exact death rate. More research could be done. I've not done research into death rates or how much we can find out. But the death rate probably wasn't very high, except in 1599, and 1665-66. Those two were the high points. But lots of people, of course, were sick. They couldn't go to work. And it seems lots of younger people were affected, unlike our situation last year, when I think 40% of deaths were in care homes. There weren't any care homes. But it seems to me that lots of infants, you know, there's infant mortality was high anyway. And one of the reasons for the lack of population growth in Europe in these centuries is the plague is exacerbating a situation called infant mortality. Because of every 1,000 children born in King's Lynn and West Norfolk Borough Council every year, what percentage die in their first year? That's called the infant mortality rate. It's very small. If you go back to the 17th century, we're talking about maybe 300 or 400 people, kids, die in their first year. Therefore, they don't grow up and have kids. And their kids don't, so their kids can't have kids, and so the population doesn't grow. So this infant mortality and the fertility cycle, it's possible, and I don't know this, it's possible that more women died, young women died in the plague, which again would have put a huge brake on population growth, because there's fewer mums to be. But the mortality rate was always high, and the plague exacerbated it. And even though 1665 was the last of the plague, the major outbreaks, it was still in Europe, and it came from Egypt to Hamburg, and in 1743 there were ships coming from Hamburg to Lynn, and the news got out. The plague is coming from Hamburg, where there had been an outbreak of the plague. Remember, our last outbreak was way back in 1665, and there was immediate panic, because when ships came in, they put them in quarantine. They made them anchor on the west side of the Ouse as far away as possible, or they were directed into the River Nar. And the porters, the guys who unloaded ships and loaded ships, they were the police force. You know, they were there to stop sailors disembarking, to stop goods going on, and to be some corn, obviously some barges bringing corn up from Peterborough, say, they must have been allowed in. There must have been rationalisation that some barges would have happened. Of course, it must have happened to feed the population. But they were so scared, they were traumatised by it. Even then, the mayor said, that isolation, desolation and disaster accompanied every plague outbreak. So they could remember what had happened, and they were traumatized. The whole idea of the plague traumatized people. We now call it long COVID, but there was something similar in those centuries to people, because some people, a lot of people recovered. They were just sick and couldn't work. Places closed down. The inns in the first plagues in the 16th century, Lynn had lots of public houses or taverns, inns where people stayed, because it was a commercial town. Sailors came in and went to the cheap inns and slept in the attics. They slept in one or two places in South Lynn, like Bridge Street. We were there, one or two of us were at Bridge Street yesterday. In one of the older houses there, in the attic, there's doodling on the wall. There's ship's graffiti on one of the old houses there, which obviously is a sailor in his hammock trying to get to sleep and sort of drawing on the wall. They're on walls, there's graffiti. There's graffiti in the porch of St Nicholas Chapel. All over our country there is graffiti, which is largely hidden and invisible, but there's a chap called Matthew Champion who's found out a lot about it. He's the one who found out what was in St Nicholas Chapel porch, and all the churches and all the lots of ships, because of all the sailors. Remember, sailing ships require lots and lots of people to make them work. Sailors, the putting up the sails. And when steamships came, the whole population of the maritime population plummeted, and a lot of these pubs then closed. But the place was packed with pubs, and the mayor told the publicans or the tavern keepers not to admit people from outside Lynn, to send them away. In other words, that if you came to Lynn, you wouldn't get a bed for the night. So even the innkeepers were warned not to accept people. So the whole system, on one side of the coin, it's local state enforcement to try and control this thing. On the other side of the coin, of course, unlike today, perhaps there's this big religious thing. And I've often wondered, we'll never know, how many people attended church services in the 16th and 17th century during these plague outbreaks. I would suggest that quite a lot did, and prayed for it to go away. And when it did go away, the church, when the outbreak of plague, sometimes they lasted 3, 4, even 6 months, the bells rang of St Nicholas, the church bells rang in celebration when the plague stopped. And it says in the minute book of the mayor's minute book, it has pleased God. You see, so there's this interesting two sides of a coin to all this stuff. But we know very little about the religious side and what people thought and how many people attended church. But we know a great deal about what the council did, because it's all written down. It's in minutes of the council minutes. Not always a great deal of detail, but there is quite a lot of detail about these things. And well, I'll just give you one before I turn to the pictures, is people who were ill, many people were taken to the town walls and they built shelters, lean-tos, just against the town wall for these people to be isolated from the main streets. And families were allowed to go and feed them, but they had to feed them on a long stick. So they'd put a potato in a bag or something, or hang a potato on a long fishing rod. So all have fishing rods, you know. But on a long, and they passed the potato, but they were warned not to go close, not to touch them, and the council appointed soldiers. And there was a chap called, in 1665, called Moses Hurst, so he got his name, who was given a special kind of blunderbuss, who would shoot people who didn't obey the rules at the town walls. So there you are. Now Rebecca showed, I think I've got this right. So there we are. And that's just Lynn from the west in 1731. And you can see the west side of the town, how open it is for ships coming in, like today. I mean, that's why in the Second World War, there was a big theory, I don't think there's much in it, because in Hamburg, they used to build, in the Second World War, these big seaplanes. And the Germans were going to invade, there are lots of stories about invade. All these seaplanes full of German paratroopers would land in the Wash and take over Norfolk, and then march to London. You know, because these sort of things go around, don't they? And King's Lynn had a Dad's Army at Gaywood and the Town Hall, but we also had a naval Dad's Army. They were all recruited to the O's Bows Club, the Ferry Lane Social Club. They were recruited there, and we had 2 launchers, which used to go into the Wash to wait for these German seaplanes to land. So we had a Dad's Navy, as well as a Dad's Army, because Lynn is open, isn't it? I don't know if you've been out in the Wash, but if you're out in the Wash on a ship and coming into Lynn, you just come in. You know, there's a whole river side to jump off your ship and so on. There's no wall. In Danzig, which is now in Poland, but was a German town in the Middle Ages, they built a wall along the quay. So even if you did come by river to invade, you had to get through gates. But we didn't. Well, think about it. It had been enormously expensive to build a wall around any town. Enormously expensive. And also an obstruction to traffic. So it didn't happen in Lynn. So look how vulnerable we are. But this is 1731. But at Riverside, with the 2 main churches, that's the spire of St Margaret's fell down. It didn't change very, it was the same earlier. And that's a close-up, but you can see the lantern on St Margaret's and the spire, that fell in 1741, that was pulled down because of that. The Greyfriars Tower is still there, the burial. That's St James's Chapel, which at this time was the town workhouse. The records for the workhouse are very good. If you're interested in Portlaw, we've got a Trujar publication on the St James's Workhouse in the 18th century. Someone years ago, and he's a solicitor, now retired, gave me this wonderful big leather-bound book, well, only to look, I gave it back to him, 1730, 1770, it's full, you'd never believe the names, the detail of the King's Lynn workhouse. So I use that to write this little history of the workhouse in the 18th century. And that's Clifton House Tower, that's still there of course. Now the Custom House had this on top, but that also fell in 1741. And there's the tower the Turners built. Unfortunately, that tower has disappeared. But you can see all these openings are not doors, they're water gates where lighters went through into buildings to load and unload. But you can see how open it is. All ports are open, aren't they? Open access. And that's just showing all the coastal trade. In the 18th century, 17th century, there's the Wash with Lynn. The Wash in the 17th century at any one time probably had, it's been estimated because we've got the port records, 300 boats of various sorts were in the Wash at any one time, going between Lynn and Boston, Wisbech and Lynn, Wisbech and Boston, full of craft. You know, there's no lorry, sir, there's no good motorways or railways, everything is water, water, water. And that's Newcastle, where, I don't know if you know Newcastle, we go about once a year to I like Newcastle. Hopefully we're going to go in late August for a break, That's the old bridge at Newcastle, which was pulled down. But some of these ships are colliers. It's from the Newcastle. Well, that's the cathedral. That's Newcastle Cathedral. St Nicholas it's called. But all these ships are colliers, which came down to London. But after London, guess what? King's Lynn was the second biggest destination for colliers, because all the coal went upriver to Cambridge and Bedford and Bury St Edmunds. Lynn supplied 10 counties with fuel. So none of the ships, the sailors. So it says in the town council minutes, plague outbreak in Newcastle, close the gates. What good did that do? And get the porters ready. Colliers from Newcastle mustn't land. They must be put down the west side of the River Ouse and not come ashore. Panic. Many, many colliers. And that's where the power base was, where these merchants met. These are butcher shops. This is an artist's impression, 1423 it says. But that's where the decisions were made. That's where the aldermen, the mayor and the common councillors met and fretted and didn't know what to do. But they copied the Dutch to some extent, I think. But in a sense, they did know what to do. As far as they knew, was very similar to what our government's done in the last year. Well, that's just the stone hall. That's where they used to meet, because there was no assembly room until 1767 at the back of the medieval hall. So this was their meeting place. The window here was rebuilt in 1766. So it's not the original medieval, except in scale, of course. Oh, the jambs are medieval, but the actual framing of the lights, they were all rebuilt in 1766. But that's where people met. That was the power base. And some of the houses on the main road, in fact, yesterday we were standing about here. The plaque I mentioned earlier is about here. And so this is the Greenland Fishery, 1605, and the roof was raised about 1610 a bit. And this was on the main road from Lynn to the Southgate, or Southgate to Lynn. So all the traffic coming from the south, London, Cambridge, came through the Southgate, down Friar Street, All Saints Street, Bridge Street, because there was no London Road until 1803. There isn't a London Road. So this is a major highway, and all this traffic had to be stopped. You know, the gates were closed and people turned away. It's interesting, when the plague ended, and they thought, well, the plague's gone, you know, obviously they opened up again, much to their relief, because all towns suffered income, didn't they? It was great suffering. Well, look what's happening today, you know, with the hospitality industry, and especially, you know, business, you know, the business side of all this is a gigantic dimension. It was then. And that's William Snelling. He was one of the leaders of it. That's what they looked like. That's all I'm showing you this for. There he is. It's oil on wood. It's in the town hall. That's how they dressed. And what they're holding there is their merchant. Every Lynn merchant had two sort of scrolls with them, and they carried them around sometimes. And one was a day. They called it a day book. And it said what money was coming in and what money was going out, what money was coming in. If you didn't pay them in time, you went on to another roll, and that's called the debt book. So they had a debt scroll and a day-to-day scroll. So you only went into the debt book if you didn't pay back when you were supposed to pay back. But that's what he's holding. He's holding his day book. What he owes and what's owed him. And that's where he lived. We think it was him who did the lovely murals in Clifton House Tower. I don't know if you've seen them, they're very faint, but Dr. Thurley's one of his next projects in restoring the house is to restore the murals, which are early 17th century. They coincide with his residence there, and he died in 1623. So we're hoping that one day we'll be able to see these early 17th century murals. So they lived in these big houses. There were several towers like this in the 16th and 17th centuries. Most of them were built in the 16th century. In the city of London, the first tower, copying Italy, Pisa especially, not the Tower of Pisa, but other towers in the Italian port. In the city of London, it was 1541. And the people who built towers in the city of London from the first half of the 16th century, they were very unpopular because their neighbours thought they were being used to spy on them. You know, but in Lynn, there was no such complaint. There weren't enough towers really to really worry people. But it was a status symbol. If you could build one of those, you had a bit of dosh. Notice the brick. And St Nicholas Chapel, and the burial ground you can see here must have been used. It was closed in 1853 when shortly before Hardwick Road became the official borough cemetery. It just got full up, but it got full up not because of the plague of the 17th century. The reason this burial ground, you can see, is higher than the chapel. Burial grounds are always higher, aren't they, for obvious reasons, because they bury earth back, another grave. Was the smallpox. Lynn suffered greatly, like many English towns, in the 18th century from smallpox. And many people were taken here then. But St Nicholas, there were services here. Wouldn't it be great to go back to 1636 and on a Sunday, what was happening, what was being said? From Cromwell's period, in the middle of the 17th century, in the 1650s, where there weren't any plague outbreaks. But in Cromwell's period, the poor who wanted poor relief had to go on Friday mornings. They had to go to St Nicholas and St Margaret's to church to listen to a long sermon to get their dole money. That's what the Puritans implemented. Imagine that today. And in St Nicholas, that's the Green family. These are just showing you the mural monuments. That's Mr. Green. Look, there he is. Look, he's holding a prayer book in one hand. But what's more prominent? There's his prayer book. But what's the most prominent hold? His day book, his money. And that's his wife, Susanna. And there are all the kids, look. And there's the skull, which is a symbol that we all die, that mortality. Mortality will come. We're all going to die. That's why you see skulls. And the town defences, this is the town. You can see here, they're all vulnerable. Here's the River Nar, where they put ships for quarantine. South Lynn was very sparsely populated. Here's Friar Street. There are no packed streets like there are today. And the town defences wall was here, but most of the town defence, there was another gate there, and a gate there. It was earthen banks. It wasn't even a wall, because it was very, very expensive. But they had to have people patrolling, I guess. They must, between the built-up bits, they must have had soldiers patrolling, or part-time. They were usually shopkeepers who were paid a small sum. They were like special constables. That's who they used for wardens to enforce the rules. The fleets, a lot of people lived by the fleets as well, which were the most insanitary places in Lynn to live were on the fleets, because the fleets were used as a sewer virtually. And throughout history, if you read the town council minutes, which I don't expect you to do, but I skim it, one of the recurring themes through the centuries is the state of the Purfleet and how filthy it is, and how the property owners each side are meant to clean it. And then then the council employed someone to clean this bit in 1763, and he cleaned it in a rowing boat with his mate, or in his lighter, and he took the stuff out of the Purfleet but dumped it in the river. He got the sack. He was meant to take it into the ocean and put it somewhere around North Lynn. And this just say Truge the cottages are 1800, so they weren't there at this period. But this part of the town was quite densely packed. We do have just one occurrence in, I said, early 17th century, when there's an outbreak just in the north end, which is good. The fisher folk kept fishing. They went out there, brought it back. There were lots of interlopers from other ports saying, we want some of this, because the wash is full, teeming with all kinds of fish. I shan't detail them all for you, but the mayor was so concerned about interlopers that we had pilot boats. Today we just have two pilot boats, and we have 3 pilots today. But even 10 years ago we had 6 pilot boats, and in the 18th century we had a number of pilot boats. And the mayor, with an armed guard, used to go out on the head pilot boat, because the pilot boats brought ships in, and also smaller boats. Pilot boats took convoys up to Cambridge and so on, and Ely. The mayor went out into the wash with his armed guard to warn off people from other ports who were interloping into this rich fishing ground. And there's a typical Tudor building around the corner. Unfortunately, this is now a private house, but I think it's up for sale, or I think it's been sold. And It's got the Tudor canopy. Unfortunately, the canopy seems to have got lost. There's typical, this is 15th century, but this is what Lynn looked like. Most of the buildings in Lynn streets look like that. You know, timber frame with brick infill. All this bit here, which was historic houses, Trujar's just around the corner, they were all demolished in 1973 for that car park you see opposite the council offices. And there we are at Market Lane. And that's the Fisher Fleet. Believe it or not, that's the old Fisher Fleet. That wouldn't look very different in the 17th century, although this public house, the Tilden Smith, is round the corner up there. That's 1842. Believe it or not, those range of buildings, if you look relocated, they're right in the middle of the Alexandra Dock.
Yeah.
Because this is the Gaywood River, and it's going, that's Gaywood over there, and that's North Street. These buildings here are on this street, the other side of this street, and it was all knocked down and excavated for the Alexandra Dock. So they had to build a new fishing fleet, and the new fishing fleet was excavated in 1868, which is round the corner. If you walk up there, well, you know it, you turn left up there, you can visit the fishing fleet. But it was simply remade in 1868. It's an artificial dig. The original Fisher Fleet was the Gaywood River for centuries. And that's part of the Blackfriars Friary. Now, on that spot now is now the railway station canteen, which I used to run to the college. One or two colleagues, it's years ago now, they said the bacon, there was someone called Elsie in the kitchen at the railway buffet. Andy's keen on, but he knows all about the railways. There was well, it still is a nice buffet there, of sorts. But years ago, someone called Elsie made the brilliant bacon sandwiches. After, when we finished our lecturing at 5 o'clock at the college, about 4 or 5 of us used to go down there for tea and bacon sandwiches. No journey intended. But that's where that is, the Blackfriars, and that was demolished for the railway station. But it was in this area, and the Red Mount, of course. There's no evidence. We know that during the Civil War, the Red Mount was used to store gunpowder and so on. It could have been used. I think it was on occasions, but I can't point to any evidence. It could have been used as a kind of isolation hospital during plague outbreaks. But we need to check that up. And it's on the town defences. And that's the entrance to the Greyfriars. And the Greyfriars, of course, now has the tower. But you can see inside here was a burial ground which was used during plague outbreaks. The south gate was closed. This is 1899. They've just widened the road, but they've got the steamroller. And that's all 19th century London Road, of course. But this gate had soldiers on top. The mayor would go on top and view his kingdom. And there were shipbuilding yards down here, and he used to go to the top. If you were the mayor or a mate of the mayor, you could go to the top and watch the ship launches, you see. It was a very, very good place to watch ship launches. We even have a couple of paintings by Baines of ships being launched, and you can see these little figures on top of the south gate. Mr. Mayor. So this gate, a lot of traffic coming through, closed during the plague outbreaks, with an armed guard. And that was the East Gate, which was the Norwich Road, really, the scenic road to Norwich. And this is inside the town, that's outside the town. And you probably know this was demolished in 1800 to make the road wider. Nothing to do, we sometimes see in history, it's pulled down to get all the pictures from Houghton. That's, as they say in Norfolk, that's a lot of old squid. The Houghton pictures were sold, brought to Lynn from Houghton on a ship here, 2 ships sent from St. Petersburg by Catherine the Great to take these 200 pictures from Houghton in 1779. She couldn't believe it. It only cost her 40,000 quid. She was so pleased by this, she sent a portrait of herself by Woolman that's hanging up in Houghton, isn't it? She gave the lord of the manor at that time a portrait of herself. She was so pleased to get these art masterpieces so cheap. And this was pulled down in 1800, about 20 years after that. And but it was armed guard again, and sometimes St. Catherine, there's little chapels at gates to pray in. You may have people doing that. But this was the gate. Many pilgrims in the Middle Ages, they left Lynn through this gate going to Walsingham and so on. So pity, well, it's rather smaller than the other one. But that's the town wall. which was pulled down because, well, or a bit of the town, here's the Red Mountain up here, through there. This was pulled down because of the railway station, to get the lines out. It's about somewhere at the end of platform 1, that's where it was, somewhere there. And the east gates, this is called the White Tower, and this is where, in these little alcoves, they put sick people to isolate them from the town, and you could go and visit them as long as you had a stick, but you couldn't touch them. And they had armed guards, as I mentioned, that you'd get into real trouble if you touched them, and these people were as blunderbusses. Whether they ever used them, I don't know, but it was a kind of isolation policy, wasn't it? And but you can see it was quite extensive. And the Greyfriars Tower, these houses were pulled down in 1806 to widen St James's Street, and that's the tower, 15th century. And the burial ground there. St Margaret's, how many people were buried here, we don't know. You can see this is late 17th century of St Margaret's. It was much bigger then than it is now. And here are people at St Margaret's. Here's the graveyard. Again, closed in 1853 because it was the population of our country in the first half of the 19th century exploded, and all the old towns, graveyards, all got full up. They had to find suburban cemeteries. In London's case, big suburban cemeteries. But everywhere they had to find new suburban cemeteries. The old parish churches could no longer cope with it. And that's the St John's Chapel, where the grammar school was from the 16th century until later. Then it had to move. It was pulled down in 1779 for a shambles. But you can see where the nave used to be. That's inside St Margaret's. So there have been services here. This is Henry Bell's interior of St Margaret's. And that's the organ, look on the crossing here. So the chancel is through there. And you can see, although there's always artistic license, but quite a generous space. You could have easily spaced out. Social distancing may have applied, probably did apply. The vicar would have applied social distancing. But as I say, I was quite surprised that the Anglican churches all closed last year, and other churches as well. I was quite surprised by that. But because the space is great, and I'm sure lots of interesting sermons. And that's another picture of the marketplace. They're all clearing up after a heavy day's work. The marketplace is so important. So the markets continued at plague time. Obviously, not everyone was sick. Healthy people, there was no supermarkets. There were no shops in the high street for poor people. Poor people relied on marketplaces to be fed. They were the supermarkets, open-air supermarkets. Because they had their own chickens and pigs, some of them in the backyard and whatnot. And this is a pub, was an old pub, but this is 13th century, and inside there an even older building. But Lynn, King Street, Queen Street was full of public houses. This is some years ago. And this is the Tuesday Marketplace in the 17th century. All this was built in the 1620s. This was the custom house where merchants used to meet to do deals. This could be the first coach in Lynn, because coaches were taxed by the government. And the first family in Lynn to have a little coach and horses was the Turner family. And I think this is the Turner's coach, you see, there they are. And this is the railings around, so the market was inside the railings to make so it can be better controlled. There were also railings around because they had bullfighting. Until 1748, bulls were baited on the Tuesday market and on the Saturday market. But we've lost the railings. We've got no picture of the railings on the Saturday market. But the street from the town hall down to Nelson Street, that side, past the vicarage and the Hansa House, it was called, into the 19th century, Bull Stake Street. Bull Stake Street. So this is the Tuesday marketplace, and the market would have taken place, and over this side, near the north end, this side would have been all the fish stalls. Important. And that shows you from the ear, so to speak. Here's the fences around. There's the old market cross, not the new one. Here's the crane on the River Rose. Here's the open key. This is the common stave enclosed with warehouses. You could easily, if ships did come in, they could easily close them off or shut them down, but they weren't supposed to come near here. They were supposed to anchor at West Lynn. This is King Street, that's High Street. And these are the butcher's shambles, where the butchers used to be. So there was some butchery going on because the animals were kept in the fields just inside the gate, what we know called the walks, or this side of the walks would have had, there's pictures of on old maps, cows and so on, mainly cows, but there have been lots of chickens and so on, but there were lots of pigs, pigsties probably in lots of places. Very difficult, it was difficult to keep the town clean because of the number of pigsties. And they had orders. They say in the town council minutes, the 24th of June, 1625, everybody will sweep the streets. And there were sort of orders that one day would be identified as when everyone had to get out and clean the streets where they lived. Whether they did or not, I'm not quite sure. And that's another picture of the market with the butcher's stalls. There's the Duke's Head, so we know it must be. The Duke's Head opened in 1686. We know it must be after that. And here's all the fences around, and here's the customs house. There's the old market cross. But that marketplace is the food basket of Lynn people for centuries. Even up until the 1990s, there was a full market there, although people were relying less, weren't they? Supermarkets and so on. But I would say into the early 20th century, the market played a major role in people's provisions and provisioning people. Very important. And that's the market house. Look, it was kept, when it was raining, the butter sellers could be inside, you see, and sell their butter like that. But that would have functioned during the plague. This is what Lynn houses look like, with these sort of gable ends. You only see one or two left now. There's one in High Street, one in Norfolk Street. These gable-ended buildings are almost all gone, but they're if you see round the corner of Norfolk Street, as you walk towards High Street in Norfolk Street, on the right-hand side, before you get to the corner there is one of these ancient structures still there. And also on the Tuesday Marketplace. You need to go around the back of buildings to see the older parts. And St James's Chapel, I think this is probably the last side. There we are, Santa Jacobi, St James. This was the workhouse and hospital. We don't know how many people were hospitalised, probably maybe 200 or 300 people in there. I wouldn't have thought social distancing would have been very great inside, but the burial ground, all this was used. That's Gaywood in the distance. All this would have been used for burials. We know in 1597-98 that this was an important cemetery for plague victims, because 1597-99 and 1665-66 were the worst. You do this graph, you see on BBC television about epidemics and plagues. They do graphs, don't they? If you did a graph, the two spikes would be late 1590s and 1660s. How many people died? We're not sure, but we do know, when they buried 200 here, we do know from the records that about 10% of the town's population died during those 2 years. The other outbreaks probably less. Some outbreaks lasted 6 months, some outbreaks maybe 2 or 3 months. But I think that is it. And I hope that gave you an overview of the plague in Lynn with a contemporary twist. Thank you very much.